Today on the Finer Things in Life, I am standing on all that is left of the original Fort Jackson water battery. These bricks here. When it was built, this actually would have had enough room for cannon emplacements and to be a little bit off of the water, where you actually had men stationed here with cannons. And you can see today by the moss here and how wet everything is at low tide. Normally this is completely underwater at high tide, which goes to show how important it is to preserving these sites, because very soon a lot of them might be reduced to not much more than this. Fort Jackson was originally constructed in the early 19th century and completed in the 1820s in order to protect this vital waterway that, as you can see today, is still incredibly important to modern trade, just like it was back when this fort was built. And it was made to complement Fort St. Philip. It's just across the river over here. So today we're going to go through and we're going to learn about the story of our historical fort here, help highlight why it's important to preserve it, and help tell the story of the fort itself and the men who fought and died here. Fort Jackson was built as part of our nation's third system of coastal fortifications. We're not really on the coast, but like I said, this is a very important trade route that comes up from the Gulf into the city of New Orleans, and it helped make it a large part of the reason that New Orleans was and still is such an important part of our nation, just because of the amount of trade and goods that passed through it and have passed through it since it was built. And this section that we're at right now is actually a key part of how this fort was supposed to accomplish this, because when this was actually built, you had this wall right here that helped to protect the fort from downstream approaches of enemy ships. Now, these forts were not designed for a civil war, and they were built several decades before the Civil War occurred, and they were mainly designed to inhibit a foreign navy from coming in and doing whatever they wanted, like the British did to us during the War of 1812 in several areas. But during the 1860s and during the American Civil War is the only time Fort Jackson was actually tested in combat. And this was a crucial part of how it accomplished what it was built to accomplish. This bend behind us is called Plaquemine's Bend. And when this fort was built in the age of sail, sailing ships had to come around, slow down and tack to be able to get around this bend and continue back up the river. By the 1860s, this has started to become an outdated concept because you had steamships, you had ironclads. This was a major turning point in how wars on water would be fought. In preparation, they had drug chains that were hung from barges from one end of the river to the other to try and stop any Union ships from being able to come up the river. And then these forts would be able to fire on them from both sides of the river as they had to slow down, take this curve, and then be stuck on these huge anchor chains that were strung across the river. And a lot of Confederate leadership in New Orleans didn't think that it would even really be a possibility. And this was not given a lot of priority because they thought that large ships like those ironclads that were being introduced and these steamships wouldn't be able to make it up this river. Now, by the cargo ships that we've seen passing up and down, we can today see this for sure isn't true today. Back then, there was a sandbar blocking the entrance to the river, and it actually made it to where at least one of the Union ships that had a 23-foot draft, so how much it actually sits in the water, wasn't able to come up this river. Confederate flag officer George Hollins was one of the only ones that really advocated to try and better protect this waterway. He actually transferred out of New Orleans because of how much trouble he made trying to convince people to protect and to reinforce this area. Because what the Confederate leadership wasn't taking into account was Admiral Farragut, made famous because of his popular phrase, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," at the siege of Mobile Bay. Admiral Farragut managed to come up this river and get all but one of his ships into the channel. He's given 19 ships to accomplish the task of taking New Orleans by water. He managed to come up this channel in April of 1862, managed to cut the anchor chain that was spread across the river. And then after a 10-day bombardment of firing at both of these forts, he managed to have his fast steamship be able to run past the forts and make it to New Orleans without having to demolish these forts first. Afterwards, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, the men mutinied and were forced to surrender, leading to Union control of this entire area. So, we're standing here now on top of the modern day levee that was built as a flood control measure in this area. And here you can actually see Fort Jackson. So, this fort is actually a little bit unique. So, the third system of fortifications was all centrally planned and designed by a board of Army Corps of Engineers. And that was kind of the big thing that set them apart from the first two systems. The first system was about earthwork and timber and just kind of basic stuff like that. The second system started introducing some, like masonry fronts to earthwork and that kind of thing, but it was all designed by different engineers. So you had some really big successes like Fort McHenry in Baltimore, and you had some really big failures. The third system was supposed to be standardized and designed by the same group of engineers to be consistent and be able to provide more consistent performances in defenses of the regions that were put in charge of the defending. And Fort Jackson's unique because this land here was so soft that they couldn't build up the big gun towers that you see like on a lot of the ones that are on the East Coast or in some other areas of the state here. So instead, they had to build a shorter, flatter, wider fort that was really more reminiscent of some kind of older fortifications that you would have seen in the first couple systems. And it's five-sided. The two sides that face the water, this one here, and the other side of that triangle shape there, it's called a bastion. Those would have been facing towards the river, and when this levee wasn't here, it actually would have had a clear view to be able to fire on any ship that decided it wanted to try and go past, helping to protect and close off this waterway when it mattered the most. And on this side, facing the water, the kind of bread and butter of what this fort was designed to do, you have where the gun sits inside the wall and fires from that little opening right there. It's almost like a window. That way, your artillerymen are protected by the roof of the fort and by those thick walls there from any ship that decided to return fire on the fort. And as we move to this side of the fort over here, we can see kind of the difference on what the land-based defenses would have looked like. So, on this side of the fort, you can actually see what's left of what's called the wet ditch, or in more common terms, a moat. But we got to be fancy because we're dealing with engineers. And on this side, you can see there's a lot less of those little casemate windows, smooth, closed-off wall. And in these positions, the cannons would have been mounted on a barbette, which means they were raised up to fire over the walls. And these bastions, that's that little triangle that comes out from the wall, make it to where the cannons can now fire to the left and to the right. So if you have somebody attacking this wall of the fort or this wall of the fort, the cannons on top are able to help support the defense of that wall. Now, the unique part, though, is here. That's where the original drawbridge would have been when this fort was built. And that actually does have some flanking casemates. So you have casemates on the side. And those are able to provide a secure position for the defenders of the fort to fire on any force attempting to make it into the main entry of the fort and get across that moat there. So we'll go ahead and move on down to the fort and take a look at the inside. And so as we're walking down to Fort Jackson, we can actually see it's pretty cool, a more modern example of what coastal defense evolved into. And this was the replacement in function to Fort Jackson. And you can see it actually goes over the modern levee, which provided a better field of fire, especially after that was built, and be able to shoot longer distances than cannons that are further down. And this actually was originally mounted with 3-inch guns, which are a little bit smaller than what would have been mounted on Fort Jackson, but they were probably more effective, if anything, just due to more modern technologies and construction of the weapons themselves, which is actually a big part of what was the downfall of a lot of this era of fortification, because a lot of them couldn't withstand the modern or contemporary artillery that was available during the 1860s. We started introducing rifled cannons and what was the kind of beginnings of modern artillery systems. And these forts just weren't designed for that. They were designed for the smoothbore cannons of the first half of the 19th century. And it's one of the reasons that they were abandoned and that they weren't in use any further. So moving up to the fort itself, so you have part of the original wet ditch that was right up on the fort, and there actually would have been a second wet ditch on the outside, and you actually see a little bit more of what's left of the outside defenses, which aren't in as good of a shape as the original main part of the fort. But if you look, it's actually still in really good condition for something that's a 200-year-old brickwork, and its foundations on these 8-foot thick walls are actually cypress pylons that were put into the ground, some of which were as deep as 40 feet. I don't know if that's the case with this fort, but with the type of ground that we're dealing with and how large this fort is, I'd say it's a good bet they probably are. So now we're going across the original moat that was a part of the fort. And back in the day, this would have been a drawbridge, but for ease of access in modern times, since no one's looking to attack this fort anytime soon, we just have this nice little wooden bridge that was put in. And the advantage of building a wet moat in Louisiana is nature makes it harder to get across than it would have been even when it was originally built. I've seen some comments on the internet that kind of mention that this fort is in really rough shape or that nature somehow reclaiming it, but it actually is in phenomenal condition, especially considering the thousands of rounds of cannons that were shot at in the 1860s. There's a couple sections where the wall is starting to have some issues and some cracks, but overall, especially considering how damaged this fort was at the end of the action, it's doing really well. And you actually have the original wheels to raise and lower the drawbridge there, and your hinge right here that the drawbridge would have sat on. So let's go ahead and go inside. So, and we're in. Smooth as ever. So this is the main entryway into Fort Jackson, and here we have the guard room, and it's kind of cool. I thought when we first walked in here it might have been functional, but I think it's just a part of the brickwork. But right here, you can see these little slits in here, and on some older medieval type fortifications, these actually would have been arrow slits where you could sit behind here and fire through here. For a 19th century fort, not something you'd really expect, but a lot of them actually did have circular holes in the walls that would have been used for small arms like muskets or later on rifles that would have been able to fire through while protecting the defenders of the fort. And so in here, we can actually see what's left of a gun position, and this is a casemate I was talking about outside. So you have this bomb-proof roof, you have your cannon right here, and if any British decide they want to try again from up the river and cross the drawbridge, you convince them that that's a pretty bad idea. And we also have a fireplace here, which could have been used as a furnace at one point in time, depending on what was here originally, to make what's known as hot shot. Now, I doubt it would be on this side with the land-facing defenses, but on the other side, where we're trying to shoot at wooden sailing ships, it would have been more prominent, and they would have actually heated up cannonballs till they were red hot and fire them at ships to try and cause the timber to catch on fire or to cause magazine detonations or just in general make them have a bad day. And so we'll see a lot of that in older forts like this, but also on some wooden sailing ships, you actually can see furnaces where they actually would heat up these cannonballs, and they still exist on ships like the USS Constitution that you can visit in Boston. And this most likely was a powder magazine, if I had to make a good guess on it. Nice thick iron door, and you can separate your ammunition and powder from the rest of the firefight that would have been happening out here. So we'll go ahead and move on. Moving into the fort itself, you can see your contemporary 19th century lighting systems and AC. All original, I'm sure. And out here is what would have been your parade ground. So There was originally a 10-sided structure in the middle of the fort that would have been where you housed your men, where you had your officers, and a bunch of other wooden buildings, which today is gone, and actually a lot of it was burned in a fire. And during the course of the battle, this actually was flooded when the original levee was broken by the Union ships coming up the river, which is one of the reasons they had morale issues that led to the mutiny I was talking about earlier, where they mutinied against their superiors and forced them to surrender. So, starting out over here, we can get a better idea of what this fort would have been working with 200 years ago. So over here, you can get a little better idea of what the defenses of the fort would have looked like. So this is that bastion I was talking about earlier. So you actually see some remnants on some of these where you have raised positions where the cannons would have been, and they're able to fire and barbette over the side of this wall at enemy forces coming over land. These are primarily designed as seacoast fortifications. So that's the important part over here for the purpose of the fort. But they were also designed to withstand land attacks as well. What's cool is they were originally designed to be able to stand up to a siege for about 10 days while we waited for reinforcements to come from inland. Mind you, in the Civil War, the function changed a little bit, but based on the original design, they were actually pretty successful because the average time for the Union military during the Civil War to take one of these third system fortifications was actually about 2 weeks, which is really impressive considering that they weren't designed to stand up to that kind of modern technology. So as we kind of look around here, you can get a really good idea. So on these three sides, the one that we're on currently, that one there, and then that one on the far left, those are your land-based signs, and those are the ones that have the cannon positioned on top to fire over the wall. And we can see where the brick changes over here, where you have more casemates and gunners able to fire from inside the fort at any ships coming up the Mississippi River. And even with the levee in place today, you can see you still have a clear line of fire from on top of the fort, even to this day, which is pretty cool. I've seen a lot newer houses with a lot more foundation issues than this 200-year-old fort does with its 8-foot walls. So this is the other side of those front-facing, flanking casemates that we saw by the drawbridge earlier, and you can see the sign here, erected in 1823. So about 40 years before it fought its first battle, first and only. And back here, you can get a really good impression of what those gun emplacements would have looked like in that casement. Right here. And actually, it looks like somebody had a fire in here as well. Just over here, there's actually some ashes in this fireplace here. But still a completely functional chimney, which is kind of cool. Look, more original electronics. Vintage. So now we're walking into the main functional part of this fort, which is those two water-facing sides used to protect against a sea-based attack. So, going down here, this is going to be underneath one of those bastions that we saw up on top. And you can see the difference because that is not facing towards the water. That is facing right across that wet ditch. To anybody who made the mistake of trying to get to the fort in this direction, you can see the other one right on the other side in order to do the same thing. And you can also see the openings to all of the other casemates that would have been used to protect against a water attack. So, and this fort withstood a 10-day siege quite well from all accounts. The Union report of the fort after they captured the area actually said that it was still they said it was still close to its original efficiency, so still in just about good enough fighting shape as it would have been before the battle. The main thing was that the Confederates just gave up and lost morale after the Union ships were able to bypass this fort, speed up the Mississippi River, and then take New Orleans. And after the fall of the city, morale was already low before that, and they mutinied and forced a surrender of the fort. And a big part of it was as they were getting shelled, they're inside these casemates with ships over on the river firing at them all night, rocking the walls, and then eventually the levee burst, and this whole parade ground out here was flooded. And it made for some less than happy people inside the fort, which is understandable. But this open space would have made it really easy to have multiple gun crews being serviced. You could have helped bring more ammunition and supplies from magazines. It's actually a really well-designed part of the fortification, and it goes all the way down this side. And you can see some of the ventilation shafts and all up on top still. And somebody's got more firewood. Some of the ironwork and all is still here. That's kind of cool. And right here you can see casemates for 24-pound howitzers used as jails after 1862. And you can kind of see in there. Here, let's see if we can take a better look. Let's try and see if we can get in there. So it's not really connected that much. I wonder if that part was used as a jail cell specifically. So another one of those bastions. So we were at a corner and starting this new side of the fort. We have the second water-facing battery and casemates here. And look at some of the concrete work right there. That's definitely not original. So this must have been part of the fort that was turned into a prison. See, right there too. All that's blocked off now. And this would have been most likely another entry into the bastion at the corner of this part of the fort, where we have another one of those flanking casemates. See right here, this part's a little bit more degraded, but again, for 200 years, it's not bad. You see some of the foundational brickwork in here as well. What was this? Oh, here we go. This right here was your furnace for the hot shot that I was talking about earlier. So you have this big brick furnace. You see actually what's left of an iron door here. And you would use this furnace to heat up cannonballs till they're red hot. Get a pair of tongs and you bring it out here, and you got your men right here at this casemate ready to load that hot shot into the cannon and fire it at an unsuspecting ship out there. Or a suspecting one, depending on the case. And this most likely was the same thing at one point or another. So where this concrete building is now, that's where you would have originally had the fort citadel, or a place of last refuge and defense. And it would have had those musket holes we talked about earlier on the side of the citadel, where they're able to shoot at anybody once they had made it past the walls, got into the fort, and try and hold out a little bit longer, which never actually came down to it in combat because they ended up surrendering the fort after the Union ships had already ran past and got into New Orleans anyway. But that was the general idea. We actually have what is actually from the 1890s, from the Spanish-American War. This was built because there was a lot of fears of the Spanish coming up and attacking the coast of the United States, as we have conflicts and fights going on in Cuba and the Philippines, and kind of America's first push into expanding and some pushes for imperialism. There was a little bit of a concern and fear nationwide of Spain coming up the Mississippi River and doing the same thing that the British did during the War of 1812. So this was built to house ammunition for the battery outside that we saw earlier with the 3-inch guns, and then also to mount some additional guns here. So you can actually see right here where the gun used to be. See where there's some water and some algae growing there? That was originally the gun emplacement, and it used what's called disappearing guns that were common of that era of fortifications, where they could go up over the parapet, come down, be reloaded, and go back up. And the guns fired from here had about an 8-mile range, while the guns outside were a little bit smaller and had about a 4-mile range. So if we go up here, I think we can actually get a good view of both of them and show some contrast as to how Fort Jackson evolved to meet the nation's coastal defense needs. So let's go check it out. So, upgrading from the smoothbore cannons that would have been here originally on these two seaside facing or riverside facing walls of the fort, we then had from smoothbore cannons to rifled late 19th century artillery that would have been in place right here. It looks like it was actually an 8-inch gun. So you have these 8-inch guns on the inside and then 3-inch guns on the outside, and you can see that just in this trees, the other battery that was built, Better Millar, and then Battery Ransom in here, and that ammunition storage facility in there. So let's see what else is left of this thing. And it's really good to see the kind of return of investment. This fort originally cost almost a little bit more than $400,000 when it was built, which sounds like a bargain today, but for something in the 18 teens and 1820s, that's quite a bit of money, which also again shows the impressive and the dedication to build this system of fortifications, because you can't really imagine a project today going on for 50 years and costing that much money and not having issues with funding and with congressional approval. But it's amazing what we were able to accomplish at the time. And again, the return on investment is incredible. And if you look too, you can see some of the different stonework from the original masonry that was most likely installed as this fort was used as a prison and then as a Spanish-American War era coastal defense battery. We're going to come back down this ladder and we'll test and we'll look at the inside of this emplacement if we can. And we're going to put a lot of trust in the 1890s construction workers and hope this ladder doesn't fall down on me. They don't make them like they used to. And you can see the second position the second firing position right here that they built for this emplacement. What's funny is if you look at the concrete on the wall here and on the inside here, even though this was built about 80 to 90 years later than the rest of the fort is in actually about the same or better condition in most places. So again, it's really impressive. The older you get, the better shape some of this stuff is in. We have powder and shell magazines and elevators for disappearing guns. So the elevators, that means that they had a way of moving the ammunition and the powder to the top from this magazine down here, which is pretty interesting. They actually do the same thing on a lot of warships to move ammunition and powder to the top of the ship where you fire the guns. So this would have been your ammunition storage. And a lot of times they'll store your shells and your powder in separate areas. So if I had to venture a guess, you probably had your shells and your powder in these separate compartments in here. Interesting. And again, for 125 years old, we're not doing too bad. I wonder where the elevators used to be. Or if this was the elevator, I don't know if this moved maybe? Maybe this part. Let's go up top and see if we can find out. Here you go. Right here. So this wasn't part of the elevator system when it was still functional. You can see down there, there's that grate we saw, and that goes down into that powder magazine. So you have your gun emplacement here. Guy from down below sends up your ammunition, and you are right there to load it into the magazine, to load it into the weapon itself. And then that gun, you're able to load this from that elevator, all behind cover, load it into your gun, and then that disappearing gun will then go up, over, fire whatever you need to fire at, come back down. Make it a lot safer for people who actually need to work these guns in a combative environment, although this never would have seen combat. And here you can actually see exactly where we are above those gun positions and those casemates from below, because you see where the chimneys are coming out from all those little furnaces and fireplaces that we saw down there. So, and actually on the outside there, you can actually see one of the original outer walls and extra systems of defense of the fort right there too. And just on the other side, there would have been originally have been a second wet ditch or moat, like you can see right there. So moving this way, we can kind of see what those bastions would have looked like, the ones that we saw next to the wall, from actually up top where there would have been the fighting position. So you can see right here. So you can have men who are manning these gun positions over here and along this wall, and you can actually move right into that firing position from that bastion down these stairs and through one of these little tunnels like this. All right. So you get a nice secure position moving out here, and then looks like we have another furnace over here. So underneath this, you have another one of these casemates. And it looks like it could have been a furnace for hot shot, which would make sense because the river is right there. So positioned from this area, from this fighting position, would be able to fire onto the river. But there's also some concrete work done on the outside that's obviously a little bit newer. So I'm wondering if this used to be open on one side or another, or if this is just part of the building. But it's definitely been modified since it was originally built. Gone over some of the original plans of the fort, but this definitely looks a lot newer. On this side here, we have one of those raised fighting positions. And this is what I was talking about when I talk about guns being fired in barbette, because you have a raised position here to mount your cannon, and it gives you a clear field of fire out onto the river, and then also onto the surrounding land as well, or to support defenders on the other wall. And looks like another one of those furnaces right here. The scope and scale of this fort and the way it was built and the way it's set up kind of makes you wonder if you didn't have names like Admiral Dewey of later Spanish-American War fame and Admiral Farragut. If you just had some normal naval officers, if this fort might have held on and done its job a little bit better during that battle. Thank you for joining me today on the Finder Things in Life. Today we got to find Fort Jackson. I'd like to thank Plaquemine Parish and Mr. Mark Cognevich, who gave us permission to come out here and film and helped us to preserve and promote the history of this historic fortification. I'd appreciate if you'd like and subscribe this video so we can try and get more history out there to the world. And if there's anything I missed in this video or anywhere else you think needs to be promoted more or I need to go and cover, please comment and let me know. Thank you.